have a great pleasure now of introducing you to our keynote speaker for this evening. Professor Peter Greste has been on the ground for some pivotal moments around the world. He's been part of what we journalists do, writing the first rough draft of history. For Peter, that has included covering the civil war in Yugoslavia and historic elections in South Africa in the 1990s. Peter's CV also includes the royalty of international journalism with agencies like Reuters, the BBC, CNN and Al Jazeera. His passport history would contain stamps from dozens of countries, including working stints in Bosnia, South Africa, Afghanistan, Kenya, Chile and the United Kingdom. But of course, it was during his time working in Egypt that Peter moved from reporting the news to unwittingly becoming the news. In December 2013, Peter and two colleagues were arrested in Cairo on terrorism charges. They were convicted and sentenced to 7 years in a case widely condemned as an attack on press freedom. Under enormous pressure, Egypt released Peter and he went on to become a champion of press freedom around the world. He wrote about the experience in The First Casualty, published in 2017. His stance has earned him numerous awards, including the Australian Human Rights Commission Medal, the RSL's 2016 Anzac Peace Prize, and the Australian Press Council's 2018 Press Freedom Award. Peter is today still working as a journalist, an author, media freedom advocate and academic at Macquarie University and the University of Queensland. Really looking forward to hearing what he has to say tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Peter Greste.
Thanks very much. It's a fantastic honour to be speaking here this evening, and I do want to acknowledge first up Paul Osborne, the organiser of this fantastic event, who for a very tragic reason couldn't be with us this evening. But I remember being a little bit puzzled when Paul contacted me and asked me if I'd present this evening's keynote address to you guys. Because it seemed to be, honestly, an incredibly courageous thing. I mean, it's not everyone who would think, when you're looking around for a keynote speaker at a Catholic conference, that the first person you'd go to would be someone who was convicted of being an Islamic terrorist. I can see, I suspect the Daily Telegraph is going to bust a gasket tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, in thinking about the presentation this evening, I had a look at the theme for the conference, Missionary Message for the Modern World. And although I have to confess I'm not Catholic, that idea of mission, that idea of a missionary purpose is something that resonates very, very deeply with me, very profoundly with me. And I also took the time to read Archbishop Costello's social justice statement, and I gather that even though that is apparently quite an important document, not everyone has read it. It's called, for those of you who haven't, it's titled Truth and Peace. Now, the Archbishop dwells an awful lot on the first word of that phrase, on peace, on truth rather. And he describes the way in which truth is a fundamental precondition for just about everything, every human endeavour that flows on from there. That we cannot have human development, we cannot develop our communities, our societies, unless there is a fundamental basis in truth. We cannot bring communities together, we cannot negotiate, we can never achieve peace without truth. And as a journalist, this is something that resonates very, very powerfully with me indeed. It's the core of what we do as journalists. The whole point is to get to the bottom of events, to tell the truth about what is taking place. And in a lot of ways, then, I think his essay might better be characterised as truth then peace. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I go through this story, I'd like you just to keep that idea in mind about the search for truth. Let me go back to the terrorism thing. Let me start there and explain a little bit about how this happened. First, though, we need to go back a few years to 2011, January of 2011. For those of you who watch the news, you might recall that that was the period when we saw the Arab Spring. We saw huge protests, civilians filling the streets of Cairo, of Tunisia, of a whole host of Middle East countries. And in Egypt, we saw those protests topple the long-standing autocrat, Hosni Mubarak. About 12 months later, there was an interim government and interim administration. About 12 months later, there were elections, the first free elections in Egypt's history, in the middle of 2012. Now, it was contentious, but the Muslim Brotherhood, which was at the time the most potent, best organised political force in the country, won the elections. It was controversial, but all of the observers, all of the international observers, all of the electoral observers acknowledged that the Brotherhood, in fact, won that election fair and square, the first free elections in Egypt's history. I've learned over many years of covering conflicts, civil wars and so on, that organisations that make successful revolutionary movements are generally pretty rubbish at running governments. And so it was in Egypt, the middle of 2013, the government had lost a lot of popularity. There were protests in the streets about the kind of policies that the Brotherhood was introducing. And the military stepped up and said, well, listen, we're a democracy now. It's time that you left. You've clearly lost the will of the people, the confidence of the people, and here's a gun to your head to make sure that you go. So really, by any measure, it was a coup. So when I arrived, at the end of 2013, there was still a lot of protests in the streets. There was another interim administration which was trying to set up fresh elections. And the supporters of the Brotherhood were battling, often openly battling, with supporters of the interim administration, which was in turn backed by the military and the police. It was a very, very divided, a brutally divided society. Now let's go back to that idea of truth. I was trying to understand what was going on. I was there for Al Jazeera. I was called into the bureau. My base was Nairobi, and I was called up to the bureau to cover the Christmas New Year period for Al Jazeera. It was really just filling in. Now, as a few journalists in the room will recognise, the more intimately you know and understand the story, the more you're able to probe the edges of the story. You start to understand about how far you can push things before you're going to get some kind of reaction from people. But in Egypt, I didn't know that story well. I hadn't been in Egypt before. And so I wasn't pushing the boundaries. It was vanilla journalism. It's what we teach our students, the first thing in there. That if the government makes a statement, perhaps they announce some changes to the constitution, you go out and you find someone from the opposition to give you a comment, and then you grab an analyst to make sense of it all. Vanilla journalism. It just so happens that the opposition, traditionally the last party that was in power, was the Muslim Brotherhood. But the government at that time, the interim government, had taken to court accusing the Brotherhood of being involved in acts of terror. So by speaking to the Brotherhood, we, in the government's mind, had crossed that line, and we had started advocating terrorist ideology. Now, I didn't know this at the time. I had no idea. As I said, we were playing what I thought was a very straight bat. It wasn't anything particularly radical. It certainly we weren't doing anything that a lot of other journalists weren't also doing. And so on the night of December 28th of 2013, I remember I was in my hotel room at the Marriott Hotel. And I remember I had my laptop open, I was streaming Triple J. I'm a big fan of Australian indie music, and I was dancing around the room as you do. And there was a knock on the door. And it was unusual. Most of the time, whenever anybody wanted me, they used to use the telephone. But I didn't think too much about it, and I remember just buttoning up my shirt and cracking open the door. And as I did, it was flung inside as if there was a powerful spring behind it. And the room was filled with about 8 or 10 guys. They pushed me to the back of the room and they started ransacking it. They slammed the lid of the laptop down, they grabbed my notebooks, my mobile phone, my cameras, all of my gear, stuffed it into evidence bags, and took me off down to the police station and told me that I was under arrest. Now, I've been detained before. It's a bit of an occupational hazard when you're working in some of these countries. But usually the way it works is that there are a couple of phone calls. I get to call my office. They call a few senior politicians that they've got networked with. And worst, maybe a night or two in the cells, often an hour or so, the whole thing's sorted out and you either released or, again, at worst, taken to the airport and told to go. I'd hoped something similar would happen here, until I realised that things were a little bit more serious when I went into the cells that first night. I'm not sure if I'm going to try and describe the space for you. It's an 8-foot square concrete box, perhaps a little bit bigger if you sort of draw a box around the table that you guys are sitting at, maybe a little bit larger than that. That's the kind of space. And in one corner there was a steel door. In another corner there was a stinky squat toilet. And in the third corner there was a leaky sink, but that was it. No other furniture in this box. Oh, and there was an exhaust fan high on the wall and a light with a switch that was outside that I had no control over. And in this 8-foot square box, and again, just sort of picture it, if you will, in your own mind, in that 8-foot square box there were 16 guys. 16. And some of them were quite literally going crazy. I realised then that this was a little bit more serious than anything I'd experienced before. The next day, I was taken to the National Intelligence Directorate. And I learned there the charges that we were facing. As you've already heard, we were accused of terrorism. The charges included being members of a terrorist organisation, aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation, broadcasting false news with intent to undermine national security, financing terrorism. When you think about those charges, you realise they're about as serious as you could possibly get, short of literally pulling the pin on a grenade and rolling it into the middle of a crowded room like this one. We were facing very, very long time in prison. So the challenge for us was to try and figure out what was going on, because I couldn't reconcile the gap between those incredibly serious terrorism charges that we were facing and the reality of the very boring, frankly, vanilla journalism that we'd actually been doing. How was it that we'd come into this kind of situation? How was it that someone had looked at the work that we'd been doing and decided that these guys are terrorists and we need to put them on trial? Now, this was a very difficult challenge for us. This was an existential problem. And it caused me and my two colleagues who were also arrested. One was a guy called Mohammed Fahmy, who was a Canadian Egyptian, and the other was Baher Mohammed, another Egyptian producer. And we had some very, very serious arguments while we were in prison. Because, as I said, this was an existential problem. We had to get to that word, truth. We had to get to the truth of what this was about before we could understand how to deal with it, how to fight it. Now, from my perspective, it could really only have been one of three things that were going on here. Either it was that someone had misinterpreted something that we'd said on air. It was a possibility, and in some respects I kind of hoped that was what had happened, because, well, it would have been relatively easy just to set the record straight, to explain what we'd been doing, to talk through the evidence, and if there had been genuinely some mistranslation, misinterpretation, we could resolve it and go. Didn't seem likely, but that was an option. The second possibility, Al Jazeera is a Qatari organisation. It's owned and financed by the Qatari government. Now, the Qataris had been very enthusiastic supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood administration when it was in power. And the Egyptian authorities, after their brotherhood was ousted, had taken to accusing Qatar of trying to undermine Egypt. And so perhaps we'd been caught up in some sort of wider struggle between Qatar and Egypt, that we were pawns in a kind of diplomatic battle between these two powers. And this wasn't about our journalism, that we were being used as hostages in that kind of argument, in that kind of struggle. That was possible. It didn't seem particularly likely to me, because if you were trying to make a point about Qatari malfeasance, then why would you come after an Australian and two Egyptians, particularly an Australian who had no connections whatsoever with any of, or deeper connections with anyone in the Brotherhood or any other organisation? There are plenty of other journalists who had deep networks, legitimate networks, who you could have made that case, but not me. And the third possibility was that this was an attack on press freedom, that this was an attempt to send a very clear message to all of the journalists that were working in Egypt. Either you toe our line or you face the consequences. You do not speak to the Brotherhood, because if you do, this is what will happen to you. So as I said, we really wrestled with this. Part of the problem for us was that the Egyptian judicial system was so utterly opaque that we had no real idea how it operated, what the kind of forces that were working behind the scenes within the judicial system, within the Interior Ministry, where the judicial system sat. And so we really didn't know which arguments were going to work. Because as I said, if it was mistaken identity, we could just stand on the evidence of what we reported. If it was politics between Qatar and Egypt, then we could align ourselves with Egypt, portray ourselves as friends of Egypt, as not as part of this conspiracy, or at least not acknowledge a conspiracy but deny our role in it. Or, which struck me as quite a cynical thing to do, or we could say, no, this is about press freedom and we stand on the principle. We fight it on that basis. Now in the end, when we couldn't answer that question with any great clarity, we decided to flip it. If we don't know what the right answer is, if we don't know which will work, let's invert the question. How will we feel if any of those strategies fails? And when we did that, things became so much clearer. Because as far as I was concerned, the cynical choice, the choice to present ourselves as friends of Egypt in some way, was ultimately a lie. It was based on a lie. And if it failed, I'd have felt utterly sick. So the only choice for us at that point was to recognise it as an attack on press freedom, because we hadn't been engaged in any terrorism, any conspiracy. Our work stood for itself as far as I was concerned. And so if it wasn't about acts of terrorism, it had to be about press freedom. And that's when I wrote 2 letters declaring it to be that, and we smuggled them out, and that framed the whole argument afterwards, and it helped galvanise a very potent international response. Now, the fact is I don't know the counterfactual. I don't know what would have happened if we'd taken a different strategy. But I remember recognising that actually I think we'd done the right thing. When one day, down in the basement of the National Intelligence Directorate, there is quite literally a dungeon. It's a concrete holding cell where prisoners are taken on any given day, and the interrogators then call them up to be interrogated, to be questioned. And I was down there, and you sit down there for hours sometimes, it feels like forever. I was down there for hours and hours, and eventually a guard comes and he says, so Mr. Peter, you come? And I got my hands through the bars, had them cuffed, and he was leading me up towards towards my interrogator's room. And as he does, he turns and he says, so Mr. Peter, where are you from? And I said, oh mate, I'm from Australia. And he goes, Australia, welcome in Egypt. I was like, thanks dude, I'm really looking forward to seeing the pyramids sometime. The reason I tell this story is because I recognised in that moment that he didn't see me as an existential threat. He didn't see me as a terrorist in any significant way. I was there not because of anything I had done, but because of what I'd come to represent. And when I saw the way that our interrogator was operating, I realised the same thing, that he wasn't taking us seriously. There was no kind of network, there was no cell, there was no explosives, there was nothing really in there for them to find. But this was about what we had come to represent. There was another moment too, I remember, again, when I realised that we'd taken the right approach. At the beginning of the trial, the process in Egypt is to present the evidence, to literally read the evidence into the court record. And so the judges sit there and they're presented with all of these evidence boxes and they're opening them up, and the judge says a camera belonging to Mohammed Fahmy, a notebook belonging to Baha Mohammed, a laptop belonging to Peter Greste, and as he pulls it out, he opens it up, what comes out? Triple J. And I did exactly what you just did. I burst out laughing too. I almost got myself an extra tight period of time for contempt. Because I realised in that moment that nobody had even bothered opening up my laptop from between the moment I was arrested until the moment the trial began. That this wasn't about the evidence. It had nothing to do with the evidence. It was all about the politics. The problem is when we talk about truth and this search for truth, is that it's a very, very slippery beast. It's a very difficult thing for us to get our hands on. As a journalist, I'm constantly grappling with this because I've realised over the years that the deeper you look into these issues, the deeper you look into stories, the more complicated truth seems to be. We often approach stories with fairly two-dimensional views of the way things really are. We have our ideas of villains and heroes, the good guys, the bad guys, the perpetrators and the victims. But the more we look at these things, the more complicated and difficult it often gets. And I sometimes think about the story of three blind men who each encounter an elephant. And the first says, I know what this is, it's just like a snake. A little bit warmer perhaps, but still wriggly and long and, sort of tube-like. Next guy says, no, you've got it all wrong. They're like trees, a big trunk with this weird sort of papery bark. The third guy says, no, you guys, you've got no idea. It's like a house. It's a big, flat, wall-like thing. Now, the thing is that each of those men, each of those people are telling the truth, but from their own very limited, narrow perspectives. You can imagine them arguing and getting into fights, accusing the others of lying, when in fact the reality is that none of them have the capacity to see the full picture. Now honestly, as a journalist, not wanting to patronise you, I firmly believe that we're all blinkered to a certain extent. We're all like those blind men. We can't ever, it's incredibly difficult for us, for ordinary human beings, to see the full truth because we all come with our own perspectives, our own narrow fields of view, with our own prejudices, our own ideas, our own preconceptions. That's not necessarily to say this is a bad thing, it's just being human. But this is a part of who we are. The challenge for journalists is to step aside from that, is to have the humility to both listen and recognise that sometimes those ideas, those understandings of the truth aren't really the way that we think that they should be. And to recognise our own preconceptions, our own narrow fields of view, our own blinkers, and put that aside. The problem is, and I realise that I'm in a room full of journalists, of communicators, of people who are gathered for a communications congress. And I realise that in a lot of ways what we are all trying to do is to tell stories, is to convey messages. But in a world that is awash with social media, and I know that you've heard a few panels, a few sessions on social media, the influence of the role of artificial intelligence and so on, it can often feel, particularly these days as communicators, it can often feel as though our jobs are redundant. As a journalist, we've often struggled with the definition problem, and I remember a few years ago my organisation, the AJF, held a Media Freedom Summit where we invited Brett Walker, one of Australia's leading jurists, and Brett described what he called the Assange problem. And by that he meant, how do we describe who is and who is not a journalist? How do we define the boundaries of what we do when anybody with a smartphone nowadays can produce journalism-like content, when anyone can produce a story that looks like a piece of news? It has a headline, it has a top line, it has quotes and factoids and so on. It looks like journalism. And that person can carry a business card that says that they are a journalist. And I've really wrestled with this for a long time until I realised that question of who is misleading. It's the wrong approach. That what we should be doing is thinking of not who is a journalist, not as a particular class of individual, but thinking of journalism as a process, as a way, as a methodological system for gathering, organising, assessing and presenting information in line with a recognised code of conduct, a set of ethics, a set of procedures and processes that give this information that we're trying to convey a certain quality which elevates it beyond mere bloggery, beyond mere punditry, that gives it an authenticity, that gives it a credibility and an authority, that sets it apart. That is what the Archbishop is talking about when he speaks of that search for truth. Because if we do not apply those ethics and standards to all of the communication that we're producing, regardless of whether you call yourself a journalist or a blogger or a communicator or a speechwriter or whatever, but if we do not adhere to those fundamental ethics and principles, then what we are doing is adding to the noise and not to the truth that the Archbishop so powerfully speaks of. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was fascinating, and I'm sure everyone here has thoroughly enjoyed hearing your insights. If we could just keep you for a few more minutes, I might throw some follow-up questions at you if you're all right with that. You've spoken about your journey, and wow, hasn't journalism changed since then? But what would you say are the biggest pressures on freedom of the press at the moment?
Gosh, where to begin? So, in my view, there are two big sources of pressure. Three maybe, but the first is a legislative pressure. I think, and this is a sort of core thesis of my book, The First Casualty, because I think what happened was in a lot of the conflicts of the past, say pre-9/11 conflicts, there were the kind of wars over things that you could literally put your finger on, tangible things like ethnicity, land, water, that sort of stuff. Even sectarian conflicts, I think, were fairly clearly delineated. In those kinds of conflicts, journalists were observers rather than participants. It's often very dangerous when you're covering it, as it always is when you're covering conflict. But journalists weren't specifically targets. But what 9/11 did, and I remember this very clearly, on the day that George W. Bush stood before a joint session of Congress, in which he declared the war on terror. And he said, in this war on terror, you are either with us or you are with the terrorists. Now, at the time, I suppose that seemed like a very strong, powerful, potent statement. It was very difficult to argue with. But if you think about it, if you pull that apart, what you realise is that he's making a binary choice. You are either on one side of that line or you're on the other. And if you're doing as journalists are supposed to do, and that's to interrogate, to speak to all of the parties involved, you are by definition crossing that line and siding with the enemy. And that's what happened to us in Egypt. We were seen as crossing that line and siding with the enemy. And so we became targets. And this is what 9/11 did too, in that war on terror, create a war over ideas. It changed the fundamental nature of a lot of conflicts. And in that conflict of ideas, the place where ideas are transmitted, which is by definition the media, becomes a part of the battlefield. And so that rhetoric of the war on terror gave governments everywhere the license to clamp down, to pass all sorts of national security legislation and limit and restrict the flow of information and, in a lot of respects, target journalists. Now, the CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, has been tracking the numbers of journalists who are imprisoned around the world, and they've found that we're at record numbers at the moment. 363, I think, in prison. That's a very conservative figure from the CPJ. But 2/3 of them are what the CPJ describes are on anti-state charges, and that is things like sedition, treason, and yes, terrorism. This is a new thing, and I think this is a real problem for us, and something that we need to push back on. The other challenge, of course, is the digital revolution, which has created a world in which, I don't mean to dismiss or disparage bloggers and the kind of people that communicate on social media as we all do, but it's made all information look much the same. It's very difficult to make the distinction between journalism that has been produced in line with the kind of ethics and standards that I've been talking about and everything else. That's degraded trust in journalism. I'm not saying journalists aren't partly responsible for that degrading of trust, but as I'm sure you also well understand, the digital revolution has completely ruined the business models and changed the very nature of how we produce journalism and what we produce it for. And that too has changed the shape of what we do. It's harder now to do things purely for its editorial value. We now have to focus very much on its commercial value, and that I think news for commercial value isn't the same as good quality journalism.
Yeah, and it takes me to your point and story about the three blind men and the elephants, because I guess essentially you could say that's what we now know as fake news. I mean, you can believe any one of those stories, and how do you decipher which one's the truth? Maybe none of them. How do we counter the threat of fake news?
Gosh. So I'm going to stand on my high horse here. I don't pretend to have a solution, and I'm sure that there have been a few sessions that you've been sitting through over the last day or two that have dealt with the problem of fake news and misinformation and so on. My organisation, the AJF, has a model that we believe has the possibility to deal with some of these. One of the problems in Australia is that we don't have constitutional protection for press freedom. We don't have the Australian equivalent of the First Amendment. And what that means is that Parliament is often in their rush to pass national security legislation, passes laws without having to consider its impact on press freedom. And equally, the courts don't have an obligation to protect it when these issues come up before the courts. And so we want to see a Media Freedom Act that establishes those principles in law in a way that a constitutional amendment might, but without actually having to go that extra step. The reason I'm outlining that is because I think that's part of the solution to protecting journalism. If we move away from it, if we change our definition towards a definition of journalism rather than journalist as a person, if we use that definition of journalism, then we want to see journalists broadly in Australia set up a professional association that uses those ethics and standards as a key to membership. It's a voluntary system. We're not shutting anybody out. We're not saying that you can't work if you're not a member. But if you are a member, then you can badge your work. And if you're able to badge your work, the public is able to identify journalism that's produced according to those ethics and standards and make that distinction between everything else that's online. It will not solve the problem, but it provides upward pressure on those ethics and standards, because I think journalists would want to stay on the right side of that line, continue to be members of a professional association. This is nothing new, by the way. Engineers, architects, accountants all have their own professional associations which do much the same thing, and I think we should be doing the same for journalists. It's an idea, it might help things, it won't solve it, but we've got to do something to help the public identify work that is produced that makes those standards that I've been talking about so much.
Yeah, you're right. It's a big question, and it certainly sounds like a common sense place to start. I want to touch on social media again. I know you've already spoken about it, but we can't avoid it. We all consume it. My question is about, I guess you referred to it as the Assange problem, but journalists, yes, I think that'd be a great idea if we could all adhere to that code of ethics, and that's how we go about it. But what about the people engaging with those platforms who are not the journalists but they're consuming the news? Wouldn't it be great to have a way for them to decipher who to trust and who not to? It's just so hard. Like you said, it all looks the same.
Well, this is where there is one of the problems that I think we have. There's a lot of talk about media literacy. And I think we need to work very hard on media literacy, but I'm not entirely sure that's going to solve the problem. The algorithms are designed to peak out our emotions. They're designed to engage with us at a deep emotional level, and so you're asking the consumers of social media to inoculate themselves against their own human instincts. Now, I'm not sure that that's necessarily fair. I think we need to be a lot more robust in the way that we manage and regulate social media. And I know that this is controversial. I completely get that. But we were talking at our table just before, over dinner, about how the social media algorithms are designed to to make money for those companies that are offshore. Now, that's no judgment, that's just what they're designed to do. They're not designed for us to help our communication. And I think we have an obligation to say that, no, if you take on the role of public utility, if this is how we talk to ourselves now, you have an obligation to make it safe for everybody, to produce algorithms that privilege high quality information, good journalism, accuracy, and yes, let's get back to that word, the truth over falsehood.
We have all probably heard a lot about fewer and fewer jobs in the journalism industry. Be hard to refute that. What do you think we can do to counter that trend and promote quality news?
I wish I had something that was not a glib answer, apart from subscribe to good newspapers, good news organisations, but also remind your politicians that this is a problem, that we need to figure out a better way of delivering news, because at the moment I don't think it's working very well.
So the future of journalism, do you look at that from a place of optimism, or obviously constructive work needs to be done? Constructive work needs to be done, but I often tell, because this is obviously a question that keeps coming up with students, and I keep reminding them that journalism is really the extension of the latest iteration of the world's second oldest profession. Ever since a bloke crawled into a cave to record the story of the last bison hunt, we've needed people to tell the stories about the world, to make sense of it, to document it, to produce that first rough draft of history that you spoke of in your introduction. And we always will need those people. I think we're going through a period at the moment of transition where we don't really know how this process is going to work. We don't really know what it's going to look like in future, but I'm absolutely dead certain that we will always need good journalists. Yeah, sounds good to me. Now, one final question, if you don't mind. You touched on, Peter, the theme of this year's conference, which is missionary message for a modern world. So my question is, unfortunately, at times we are finding ourselves in a world that is often hostile. How do we communicate effectively in this climate?
Oh boy, oh boy. You really do know the curly questions again. It should be straightforward. We should be able to stand on those ethics and principles that I've been banging on about and say, look, this is the way to do it. I don't have an easy answer. I think we all have to have the courage to say things, to if we know them to be truthful, to stick with that, and recognise that not everyone will see it. Recognise that the way that our society at the moment is working is tending towards more divisiveness, more polemic, and recognise that will sometimes create blowback. That doesn't change the fundamental truth of what it is that we're saying, if indeed it is rooted in the truth. And that's, I just think that we need to have the courage of our convictions to stick with those messages and hold that line regardless of what we might be hearing.
Peter, thank you so much for your insights and for being such a strong advocate for journalism. We really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you. Well, that also brings to an end my contribution tonight. Thank you so much to everyone here for the opportunity to lead this discussion this evening. I'd like to welcome to the microphone now Emily Ng, a member of the Australian Catholic Media Council, to propose a vote of thanks to Peter for his speech and for some housekeeping messages.
Thank you very much, Angie, and thanks very much for your work as MC this evening, guiding the discussion with Peter. We really appreciate you finishing work this evening at Channel 7 at 7 News and then rushing over to help make our function a success. An extra special thanks to Peter Greste again, our speaker for this evening's dinner. Peter, you've had an extraordinary life as a journalist, and I know we all really appreciated your story, sharing it with such truth and with such honesty as well. The insights you gained in your work as a foreign correspondent, I think really touched us all. And I think all of us as people in communications, as journalists, ex-journalists, can really learn from your insights and your experience. You have provided, some unique opportunities to advocate for press freedom, and particularly for me as an ex-journo who's worked in Catholic news, you've given me an understanding of the complex issues surrounding press freedom. So thank you again.